Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the White House. Thank you for conquering the stairs of the Eisenhower Executive Office building on a typical sticky Washington, D.C. summer day. My name is Mike Strautmanis, and I am counselor to Senior Advisor Valerie Jarrett. I work on what they call strategic engagement here on the White House. I don't quite know what that means yet, but I know this is it. So I'm excited to be here. On behalf of Valerie, I want to welcome you. Our office is really we call ourselves the front door of the White House. And this is really what we do. We bring in stakeholders, leaders, thinkers, those in the grassroots who are on the ground, working on issues that are important to the country, important to the global community, and bring them into the center of the decision-making process here at the White House. And this is an important issue, and I'm pleased that we're going to have this discussion on sub-Saharan African policy. As you know, and as you'll learn more about, the President has recently approved a new presidential policy directive for sub-Saharan Africa, one that really informs and provides the direction for our important work. This is a region that's going through an incredible amount of change right now. And we want to make sure at this crucial time we get your advice, we get your input as we have a two-way dialogue about the role of the United States and the new U.S. strategy at this important moment. We have a great panel that's here with you. I'm going to introduce them quickly, and then we're going to dive right into the discussion. We have Grant Harris, Senior Director for African Affairs with the White House National Security Staff. Next to him, we have Ambassador Johnny Carson, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Next to him, we have Florizel Lizer. Is that right? No. You gave me the short part where everybody calls you Flory, and I decided I was going to skip that, and I messed up the rest of it. That's okay. Flory Lazier. Flory Lazier, we're glad to have you with us, Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for Africa at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And then we have Earl Gast, Assistant Administrator for Africa at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Finally, just a point of personal privilege that I'll take on. I really have had the privilege of working with the President now and the First Lady for almost 20 years. I think it actually just is 20 years now. I worked with him in the Senate as his chief counsel. I worked with them in Chicago. This is important to him. He has what many would call a heart for Africa, and we want to do this right, and we need your help. So don't keep this a secret that we had this meeting. Tell people about it. I know we're webcasting it, but we're going to rely on you to blog about it, use Twitter, use Facebook, use the barbershops, use the beauty salons, use your board meetings and your community meetings back home to tell people about this important discussion, because we need everybody involved on this issue. We want everyone involved in this issue. This is an American issue. This is a global issue, and we look forward to a robust conversation. With that, I'm going to turn the discussion over to give remarks about the U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa to Ben Rhodes, Deputy National Security Advisor for something not strategic engagement now. That's different. We cleared that up. But for strategic communications, Ben Rhodes, thanks for joining us.
I thought engagement was a part of my portfolio, but I'll accept the amendment. So I'll just make some opening comments here and turn over to my colleagues here, I think, who will be ready to really dig down. I think the purpose of this session is, first of all, keyed off of the presidential policy directive that was recently signed out by the President, which attempts to formalize and capture and institutionalize our approach to sub-Saharan Africa. I do think, though, it's important to step back and recognize that what the PPD does, to use the acronym, is capture an approach that we've taken since the beginning of the President's time in office. I had an opportunity to work pretty closely with the President on his speech that he gave in Ghana, in Accra, where he laid out, I think, his vision for U.S. policy in the region. And that's a vision that has informed everything we've done since then and informs the PPD. And I think what we've aimed to do is two things. Number one, to build on successful efforts of the past, so approaches that were working in terms of U.S. policy towards the continent, but also move beyond that towards approaches that seek to really empower Africans, to build capacity on the continent. In keeping with what he said in Ghana, the purpose of our assistance should be to create the conditions where that assistance is no longer necessary. And I think that in talking to the President about these issues, that's really born out of his own personal experience with the continent, which is obviously deeply embedded in his own personal history and his identity. And I think it comes from two perspectives. On the one hand, I think the President has a very personal appreciation for the talent, the vitality, the entrepreneurship that exists across sub-Saharan Africa, and that we see really driving economic growth in areas, democratic development in areas. On the other hand, the President has a personal experience, too, with some of the forces that have held back development on the continent: corruption, undemocratic practices that he has spoken very candidly about when he was a senator, when he went to Kenya, in Accra once again. So I think what we've tried to do overall in our approach is use what the U.S. can do on the continent to get rid of those impediments to African development and to African capacity building, so that Africans can really drive success on the continent. Furthermore, I think in Ghana, he made a clear point that we have to stop looking at Africa as essentially a world apart. As he put it in the speech, it's a fundamentally interconnected part of the global economy, of global security, of U.S. Economic strategy, U.S. national security strategy. And so we've sought to build approaches that, again, empower Africans with the recognition that doing so is in our own interests, because the United States will be more secure, more prosperous if Africans are thriving. I would just give you a few examples of this approach, an approach, again, that seeks to empower actors on the continent. Our assistance programs have built on the success of PEPFAR and other programs that have done extraordinary work in saving lives in Africa. At the same time, they sought to build African capacity in public health, in dealing with challenges like child mortality and maternal health. On food security, as you know, which we've made a signature effort of this administration, we've sought not just to deliver assistance, but to empower approaches that can lead towards more sustainable development and more sustainable food security on the continent. On democracy promotion on the continent, the President made an interesting decision around the 60th anniversary of so many independence movements on the continent. We were contemplating what to do, whether to invite, for instance, a number of African leaders here, as some other countries were doing. And it was the President's decision that instead of simply reaching out to leaders on the continent, leaders of government, we should invite young leaders. We should reach out to civil society. We should reach out to independent media. We should reach out to young activists across the continent and bring them here to the White House. And that created what we call the Young African Leaders Forum, which not only led to a very successful session with the President, but has been a great tool for our embassies to engage young leaders, people who are really going to drive the future of the continent, understanding that many countries in sub-Saharan Africa have huge youth populations. And the United States needs to be building relationships and empowering, again, young people who are seeking to take their countries in a positive direction. The First Lady was able to build on this on her own trip to Africa, and we see this as an area that we can build to scale. On security issues and political issues, we've similarly sought to empower positive African action. In Cote d'Ivoire, when there was an election that was not being respected by the outgoing president who lost the election, President Gbagbo, President Obama was one of the first world leaders out of the box to essentially reach out to former President Gbagbo and tell him that he could not stand in the way of the democratic process, that there needed to be a transition to the rightly elected President Ouattara. And after issuing a very strong statement of his own, we also were then able to work with African regional organizations like ECOWAS, which played a critical role in not allowing a result to stand that was undemocratic and drawing a line in saying that we're not going to stand idly by while someone seeks to overturn the election results. And that ultimately, after a process of many months and much diplomacy, led to the right president being inaugurated. But again, an approach where the United States was able to put our shoulder to the wheel diplomatically, but we're also able to see Africans step forward through ECOWAS, through the African Union, and really take a positive step forward for democracy. And then, of course, with the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, you've seen the United States, again, deploy some of our forces, but to do so in a way in which we're empowering regional security forces to deal with the horrific challenge of what Joseph Kony and the LRA has done for many years. Again, an effort to empower Africans so that they have the capacity to better deal with a range of challenges. So this is a theme that I think we would aim to underscore across the board, economic, political, and security. It's an approach, again, where the United States is providing direct assistance, but doing so in a way that aims to build up African capacity to deal with a range of challenges. Now, the PPD, the policy directive, was meant to capture this vision, to assess the trends that we're seeing across sub-Saharan Africa, and to make sure that we're deploying our resources across the board in a way that more effectively deals with the world as it is. And in particular, we chose to focus on a range of areas. We want to strengthen democratic institutions across sub-Saharan Africa. We want to expand our efforts to promote economic growth, trade, and investment. Because again, in these two areas, we recognize that this is essentially the foundation that is going to allow for us to see progress on a range of fronts. If Africa has strong democratic institutions, if Africa has the ability to, again, push back against some of the challenges that we've seen in terms of corruption, that will unleash progress. If Africa is more plugged into the grid of the global economy, as we're seeing, you're going to see economies take off, and you're going to see economic growth that lifts people out of poverty more effectively, frankly, than even any assistance program could. So that's what we aim to do. We aim to define our own engagement in ways that really unleash and realize the potential that we see across sub-Saharan Africa. Because again, we believe it's fundamentally in our interest to see that type of progress. And what we're already sending out a range of officials to seek to implement this vision. The President's top advisor on international economic affairs, for instance, Mike Froman, just traveled across sub-Saharan Africa, visited several countries, in discussing ways in which we can, in addition to having effective assistance programs, can deepen our trade and investment relationships across the continent. We also are directing the departments and agencies of the U.S. government to prioritize this engagement with the next generation of leaders across sub-Saharan Africa. Taking the Young African Leaders Forum as a template, how can we make sure that even as we maintain our effective relationships with governments, we're reaching beyond governments, and we know, again, who to empower, who to engage with, that's going to be the next generation to take Africa forward. And frankly, I might add that many of you can be helpful in this regard, because we recognize that there are so many NGOs and so many people who've been interested in the relationship between the United States and sub-Saharan Africa, who have deep relationships, deep contacts, who know who the people are on the ground, who've sought to improve public health systems, who've sought to stand up to corruption. And so therefore, I think the ongoing dialogue we can have with you as people who are concerned about this set of issues can be extremely helpful in helping to connect us with that next generation of leaders. And of course, this is a strategy that reaffirms the role that the United States will play in terms of development and peace and security. Now on development, we've identified our priorities. They're in food security, and the new alliance that we launched here earlier this year brought together African governments and the private sector and NGOs behind an approach that we're really excited about that provides not just U.S. government resources, but international resources and private sector resources into ways in which we can build sustainable sources of food in parts of Africa, and ultimately, hopefully, help us eradicate the type of famine and poverty that we've seen in pockets of Africa. We've also sought to build out the Global Health Initiative, as I said, and that will continue to be a focus even as we seek to complete the extraordinary work that's been done through PEPFAR and other programs. And then, of course, on climate change, I think even as we are working domestically to address our own energy policy. We've been building out an international climate framework, and a key part of that is providing the assistance that's necessary for countries in sub-Saharan Africa to essentially skip the dirtier phases of development so that they can provide for their people through green growth. And that will continue to be a key development priority. So those three areas, food security, global health, climate change, I would highlight for you as development priorities for this administration going forward. Of course, in all that we do, we also seek to promote peace and security. And I think you'll get an additional briefing here on some of our security priorities. Again, what the United States has sought to do here, in addition to building capacity, as we've done in the LRA instance, is when we can intervene in an effective way to help facilitate diplomatic outcomes, we've done so. So in Sudan, obviously, it took a lot of U.S. effort to see that there was a successful referendum in South Sudan. But all of us are concerned about the situation in Sudan today, and we're going to have to continue to work through the United Nations and with both the North and the South to see that the situation is stabilized. At the same time, I think it's important to note that the security efforts of the United States have to be put in context. I know, for instance, that often the profile of the United States on security issues gets a lot of attention. But we see this as one piece of a much broader picture of how the U.S. engages the region. So we engage, again, on issues like counterterrorism and on conflict resolution. But we recognize that there's a continuum here, and that you're not going to have security in the continent unless you also have development, unless you also have democratic institutions, unless you also have populations that know that they can thrive in their own communities, not just because there's an absence of conflict, but also because there's an absence of poverty. And so I think it's very important to understand that the security assistance that the United States provides across the region is in that context. It's not separate from it. And that's how it'll continue to be. Because ultimately we recognize that it's the ability of individuals to fulfill their potential that is going to lead towards a more stable and secure continent. So I think the bottom line is that we see a lot of potential. As the President said in Ghana, in many respects there's a moment of promise right now in sub-Saharan Africa. You see certain economies beginning to take off. You see, I think, some very positive democratic trends in parts of the continent. And so there's really a potential for the 21st century to be a time of great African progress. At the same time, we know that there are many challenges out there that are unresolved, and that if one area is permitted to tip and spiral into conflict, or if one development challenge is ignored, or if, again, people don't have that sense that they have governments allow them to give expression to their ambitions, the progress that we're seeing today can be derailed as well. So what we're focused on, and what you'll be hearing about today, is how the United States is aiming to use all of our resources, all of our efforts, all of our influence to continue to empower the positive trajectory in Africa while dealing with the ongoing challenges that could stand in the way of progress. So I'm happy to turn over to Grant here, who's got a terrific panel. But I also want to just leave you with the same point that Mike did, which is that we very much recognize that this is not something that the U.S. government can or should do on our own as it relates to the relationship between the United States and sub-Saharan Africa. That there are people in the United States who care deeply about these issues, NGOs, students, diaspora communities, and we want to make sure that we are taking all of your views into account. We want to make sure that we can use the convening power of the U.S. government to get you together and perhaps connect you with not just one another, but folks in Africa as well. So we want to continue to have an ongoing dialogue. You should feel like you have an open line to us to share your views and to hear from us if you have any questions. And that's why we're so happy to have this chance today. So Grant, I'll turn it over to you, and I hope you all have a good day.
Thank you, Ben. I wanted to add my thanks to you all as well with Ben and with Mike, having already expressed it, but we're really thankful that you were able to join us today. We also welcome everyone who's joining us via live stream. We wanted to connect with as many people across the country and internationally as possible in having this conversation. And as Ben and Mike also alluded to as well, we see this as an ongoing conversation, and in many ways it is. This presidential policy directive was the outgrowth of months of internal and external consultations, both here and on the continent, And the product of that, as you've all seen, is the U.S. strategy, but we see that as the continuation in many ways of the vision that the President laid out in Accra. We see it as the conversation that we need to continue to have with you and with our partners in the region to try to breathe life into this and to make sure that we fulfill the vision that the President has set out. We very deliberately plan to keep our comments short. We have a great panel that can speak to all aspects of our engagement with Africa. I wanted to highlight a few points before turning to them, and then I'll go over some logistics and housekeeping about how we can get your questions, both from those of you here in the audience and also those of you who are joining us online as well. As Ben and as Mike said, we've put a lot of time into this strategy. It's got 4 pillars and strategic objectives that we're going to be talking through. The first is strengthening democratic institutions. The second is spurring economic growth, trade, and investment. And I'll note as well that the strategy specifically asks us to elevate our efforts in each of those regards. As Ben has said, those are the foundations for the long-term types of success and development and the achievement of the human potential that we want to see. The third pillar has to do with advancing peace and security, and the fourth is promoting opportunity and development. And our panel will be able to talk through all of these in more detail. A theme that runs through this is partnership. You saw that in the Accra speech. It's partnering with the countries and the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa to try to achieve this vision. And Ben spoke very much about how that we see that in the development work, we see that in the peace and security work, we see it in strengthening institutions across the board. That's a theme that is ever present in our work and has been throughout this administration. The other theme, which was mentioned as well, is the President's call that we up our game in engaging with young African leaders on the continent. This is a key component of everything that we do. It was touched off with the President's Forum. It was continued by the First Lady when she was traveling to South Africa and met with young leaders there. But since then, we've had over 2,000 events that have involved young African leaders. We've institutionalized this as a part of how we do business every day in terms of our diplomatic outreach, in terms of advisory councils that many ambassadors have in their embassies, in terms of meetings that our high-level visitors seek to have when they go to the continent. And we're building out that initiative. We're trying to connect young African leaders with each other and with Americans. We've found that that has a synergistic and very powerful effect. We've seen alumni from different programs, partner-informed cooperatives, partner-informed organizations that are advocating on behalf of youth and that are impacting every type of community, whether it's health or government or other types. We're also trying to provide skills and capacity building in terms of leadership trainings. We're looking at ways that we can partner with universities and NGOs here in the United States in order to better do that. So we're looking for ideas and partnership there as well. And we're trying to make sure that, as I said, this is something that we've got throughout every aspect of the way that we do business. It's not one forum or one meeting. It's a way of engaging. I wanted to keep it really short, as I said, because we value the questions. I'm going to introduce each panelist. They'll speak just for a few minutes about the individual strategic objectives, and then I'll describe how we can start taking your questions. Without further ado, I wanted to introduce to my left Ambassador Johnny Carson, our top diplomat on African issues, with 37 years of experience in the Foreign Service. I think he's lived in every sub-Saharan African country that we're about to talk about. He's been ambassador probably in about half. So with that, I was hoping to turn to you, Ambassador Carson.
Grant, thank you very much, and it is a pleasure to be here. I won't underscore the things that have been said by Grant and by the other speakers, and just jump into the first pillar. The President on July 11th, speaking before the Ghanaian Parliament, famously said, "Africa doesn't need strong men. It needs strong institutions." Democracy is built on the basis of strong institutions, whether they are in America, whether they are in Asia, whether they're in Europe, but like Africa, institutions matter. In establishing pillar number one, we have tried to go beyond simply defining African democracy as a successful election, because while elections are a critical part of democracy in the selection of leaders, It is only one aspect of it. Institutions matter. Institutions are important. As a result, we're focusing on 5 key areas. One is promoting accountability, transparency, and responsiveness in government. And that means promoting the rule of law, strengthening checks on the executive branch, strengthening the role of parliaments, and strengthening the role of judiciary and independent agencies in government. So it is accountability, transparency, and responsive governments which are critical. Secondly is bolstering positive models for democracy that exist across the continent of Africa. And there are strong positive models of democracy. I won't be inclusive, but I just refer to you countries like Botswana, like Mauritius, like Benin, like Zambia, like Kenya, and like what we have seen most recently in Accra, where we saw the late John Atta Mills pass away unexpectedly, and saw a very smooth and seamless transition of government to his vice president. These things are models that we think are important. They need to be encouraged, and we will support and work with Africa's democratic leadership. Third, we are very much concerned about promoting human rights, all human rights, and we have been very outspoken in the defense of press freedoms, as well as issues such as gay and lesbian rights as well. When we step away from the defense of human rights and human freedoms, we also step away from our commitment to democracy. So human rights and the protection of human rights are extremely important to us. Fourth, we want to ensure a sustained focus on the credibility of the democratic process. We want to engage with African leaders to strengthen the democratic institutions and that they have. And we want also to be clear in speaking out against democratic backsliding that may occur across the continent. But it is both the engagement with our partners, engagement with countries that are moving to strengthen their institutions, but also engaging those countries and speaking out against those countries if necessary that in fact are undermining democratic norms and tradition. And finally, we're interested in promoting strong democratic norms across the continent. And this is working with the African Union in particular to live up to all of the principles and elements that are contained on its Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. It also means working effectively with the sub-regional organizations, whether it is ECOWAS, SADC, or the East African Community, to promote democratic norms within their institutions as well. And in that area, we have in fact seen great success. In the last 5 or 6 years, it is clear that the African Union will not accept a country into its membership or allow a government or a leader to take a seat in Addis Ababa if that leader has come to power through a military coup or through an extra-legal change in government. These are the kinds of norms, transcontinental African norms, that are extremely important in strengthening the credibility of African democracies across the continent. I'll stop right there and say that there are successes out there. We are seeing a stronger and deeper commitment to democracy, not only by the people of Africa, but by many of its leaders. No question there are a few backsliders, but the trend is in a strong and positive direction. We want to continue to work with African leaders, supporters of democracy, to keep that trend moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to turn now to Assistant U.S. Trade Representative Flory Lazaire. to talk about Pillar 2. Florian, in her role, is in charge of both AGOA, but also in charge of broader efforts to prompt trade and investment in sub-Saharan Africa, and brings a wealth of experience to that.
Thank you, Grant, and this is a wonderful opportunity to be here with you. As a part of the PPD process, one of the things that was recognized is the important role that trade and investment plays as an engine for broad-based economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa. And there was also the recognition that part of the world, that region, is actually now so vital. 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. The highest rate of return on investment of any region in the world is in Africa. A lot of people don't know that. And so there was a recognition early on of the critical role that trade and investment plays, and also the fact that that region is important for our own businesses, our own small enterprises, and for diaspora-owned businesses and so forth, in terms of engaging with Africa in a new and different type of way, recognizing all of that. So there are, as a part of the Spurring Economic Growth, Trade and Investment pillar of the PPD, 5 areas that we'll be focusing on. One is promoting and enabling environment for trade and investment. This will largely look at the legal, regulatory, and institutional reforms that are needed and that contribute to an environment that enables greater trade and investment in the region. It's also recognizing that we need to work with Africa's private sector and our own private sector to engage African governments to actually undertake those necessary reforms. The second area we'll be looking at is improving economic governance. This has to do with the effective management of public finances, more efficient and transparent use of and less reliance on donor aid, and also increased transparency and accountability. We believe that these are important areas. It also has to do with protections against illicit financial activity, and in turn, developing strong public financial management systems. So that area is really critical. The third area we'll be looking at is promoting regional integration. I think many of you know that of sub-Saharan Africa's 49 now nations, many of them are small markets and they're landlocked. And so therefore what we need to do is to work with them in creating larger markets, improving economies of scale, and reducing the transaction cost for local, regional, and global trade. And we're going to do this by promoting things like trade facilitation, standards harmonization, regulatory coherence and transparency, and improving infrastructure. I think many of you who have been there know the roads, the rail, the airports, etc. This is really critical if the Africans are going to be more competitive in the global economy. And we're looking at ways that we can remove some of the challenges and the impediments to their participating effectively in global supply chains. The fourth area is expanding Africa's capacity to effectively access and benefit from global markets. I think, again, the Africans have substantial market access to the U.S. market. Something like 98% of their products are able to enter the U.S. market. But what we realize is that opening the door to our market and to other markets globally is not sufficient in order for the Africans to really play a bigger role in global trade. So we're looking at ways to work with them to improve their competitiveness, to help them meet global standards. And one of the areas that we have in terms of working on the U.S. side is working with our own Congress to extend AGOA beyond 2015, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which allows African products to come into the market. We want to extend that beyond 2015. And we also want to work with Congress right now to actually extend a provision of AGOA that has to do with third country fabric and the ability of the Africans to produce apparel for the U.S. market. So in this area of increasing their capacity and benefiting from global markets, we're also going to be working with them on meeting product standards, food safety, and sanitary and phytosanitary requirements, taking steps to improve their productive capacity, and then also looking at those supply side constraints that are raising the cost and reducing their efficiency in their exports. The final area is encouraging U.S. companies to trade with and invest in Africa. Many U.S. companies have tremendous opportunities in Africa. We have many companies that are already there. But the opportunities, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, women-owned enterprises, youth enterprises, this is an area where we would like to advance more of that happening between the African businesses and our own. So we're going to be developing a Doing Business in Africa campaign, which will harness the resources of a number of U.S. government agencies to assist U.S. businesses in identifying and seizing the opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, as a part of that, we want to work with the African diaspora in the U.S. because they have a particular way that they can help us to advance U.S.-Africa trade and investment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I wanted to turn to Pillar 3 on advancing peace and security. And our speaker on the panel is Joe McMillan, who's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He's got more than 3 decades experience at the Pentagon, and he's one of the Secretary of Defense's principal advisors on African issues, among other regions.
Thank you, Grant. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here to talk about the new Africa strategy that is guiding our efforts on the continent. From a Department of Defense point of view, in day-to-day terms, especially in relation to the resources that we devote to Africa, the new strategy really is more continuity and than change in many ways, but there are some important elements of change that shape this continuity. And I know that sounds like some gobbledygook, and let me try to explain what I mean when I say that. What the new strategy does from our perspective that is most important to our efforts is to place the security pillar that we work on in the context of the broader priorities that the administration has identified for Africa. Really, I would say that what we need to think of the defense and security cooperation really as an enabler for the other pillars. And this is something that we found out in other parts of the world, sometimes very painfully, notably in Iraq and Afghanistan, that while we can focus on development, we can focus on governance, focus on economic growth as the ultimate ways to solve the problems, the real lasting, enduring solutions to the problems that countries face, those can't be carried out in a security vacuum. And security challenges are one of the principal obstacles that many countries in Africa face in achieving the other things that we're trying to achieve. I would put this in the sort of frame this for you in the way that the President framed it in the 2010 National Security Strategy, that we have to deal with the world as it is, but we also have to have a strategy for the world we seek. And we see the security pillar of the strategy as bridging that gap between the world as it is, where there are very serious security challenges facing many countries, and helping create the environment that will enable us to get to the world that we seek through achievement of the other pillars. In practical terms, DoD will be continuing to focus on building military-to-military relations with African states, which are increasingly taking the lead in regard to the security challenges that they face. Recent examples of African leadership include the success that the African Union mission in Somalia has had in combating al-Shabaab, the role the AU is playing in brokering talks between Sudan and South Sudan, and the leading role that the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, is taking in responding to instability in Mali. As not only stated in this new strategy, but also in our own internal defense strategic guidance that was developed this past winter, DoD looks to be a security partner of choice for African countries. We want to be an acceptable partner, an acceptable country for them to work with, to recognize what we can bring to help them meet the challenges that they face. And we will be pursuing, as we have in the past, small footprint, low-cost approaches to tackling shared security challenges. An example of working together on shared security challenges is the deployment of a small number of U.S. Special Forces soldiers, about 100 altogether, to support the regional countries in helping to end the threat posed by the Lord's Resistance Army. In addition to working bilaterally, the new strategy puts an emphasis on engagement with regional organizations, including the AU, the Southern African Development Community, ECOWAS, and the East African Community, helping to build their collective capacity to prevent and respond to regionally based security threats. The new strategy also calls for comprehensive partnerships across the U.S. interagency that will leverage our collective security capabilities in areas like border management, maritime security, aviation, cybersecurity, as well as financial expertise to counter illicit movement of people, arms, drugs, and money. And we have some interesting new authorities that Congress gave us in the National Defense Authorization Act last year that will provide the capability for Defense Department funds to be leveraged by our State Department colleagues to help pursue these cross-cutting threats. And we're hoping to be able to announce the first tranche of those projects in the coming months. This has been something that we've been focused very closely on of late, particularly in relation to post-conflict and fragile states, and especially the contagion in terms of loose weapons that have come out of Libya after the Libyan revolution, which has further undermined the already tenuous security situation in many of Libya's neighbors. Now, we also, as many of you know, besides addressing threats, much of the DoD engagement in Africa is in the form of what we call building partner capacity, which is strengthening the capabilities of regional forces through training and to a much lesser degree through equipment. We'll be under this new strategy giving increasing attention to making sure that those programs not only build military capacity, but also elevate the importance of democratic governance in Africa. This means that our efforts in the areas of international military education and training and other programs that we conduct with other military forces in Africa will focus on enshrining rule of law, respecting civilian authority, ensuring accountability for abuses of the civilian population, and so forth. These are things that we have done certainly ever since the creation of AFRICOM a few years ago, but the new strategy gives them increased importance, and we're taking steps to ensure that as Africa Command designs its programs for engagement, that they take these goals and objectives into account as well. I also think it's important to note the provision in the new strategy that reaffirms our commitment to identify the risk of atrocities early and to take steps to try to prevent violence before atrocities can emerge, to use new tools to respond effectively to atrocities and to bolster domestic and international efforts to bring perpetrators to justice in conjunction with international and multilateral partners. Finally, I think I probably need to say a word about our counterterrorism operations on the continent, which naturally attract the greatest attention because it's the one area in which U.S. forces are actually engaged in what we call kinetic operations, the delivery of actual force on the African continent. Of course, that's mainly the situation in Somalia more than anywhere else. In other places, we try to carry out our counterterrorism operations in conjunction with partners and through partners. This again goes to the distinction or the conjunction that the President made back in 2010 between the world as it is and the world that we would like it to be. Unfortunately, the world as it is has an Africa that has several very serious terrorist threats of potential intercontinental consequences operating on them. Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, increasingly with tentacles into Boko Haram in Nigeria and even into the Tuareg movement elsewhere in the Sahel. As we go about those operations, we will continue to be guided by the President's affirmation that we bear no greater responsibility than ensuring the safety and security of the American people. And we will be concentrating our efforts on disrupting, dismantling, and eventually defeating Al-Qaeda and the affiliates in Africa that I just mentioned. So with that, let me wrap up, and be happy to take questions later on.
Thank you very much. And our final panelist to speak on the Promoting Opportunity and Development pillar is Earl Gast, the Assistant Administrator for Africa at the U.S. Agency for International Development. He's got decades of experience there as well, oversees over $6 billion in programming and towards African countries, and is the best speaker to address these types of issues that we're getting at in that strategic objective.
Great, very good. I want to be mindful of our time and make sure that we have time for interaction, so I'll go right into the heart of the matter. But first, let me start off by saying that the objectives, the 4 strategic objectives, are mutually reinforcing and cross-cutting. So, for example, development certainly supports economic growth in helping to create an investment climate conducive to investment. It also supports what Ambassador Carson said is critically important, accountable institutions. And certainly on peace and security, our efforts are more grassroots oriented in working with community peace councils to try and promote peace and security. So with that, let me say that the President's policy on development that came out 2 years ago really helped shape the President's initiatives, development initiatives. And so in that policy on development, there are a number of themes and principles that came out. One is that when we design our development initiatives, they should be built to scale. They should have the potential to be transformative. That we need to make sure that it is led by the government, by the people with whom we work in countries, and that there's significant commitment on their part for development. And also, one thing that has been mentioned throughout, partnerships. And for us in AID, even though there are many other U.S. government agencies involved in the development side, for us it means looking at new partners as well. And so there's a heavy reliance on getting the private sector committed to investing once development changes have taken place. So Ben mentioned at the beginning 3 presidential initiatives, the nexus of which is focused in Africa. One is the Global Health Initiative, which builds on the successful PEPFAR, but looks to broaden the impact by looking at other diseases that can benefit from the institutional building that was done with PEPFAR institutions. The second one is the Feed the Future Initiative. 19 out of 21 countries worldwide are in Africa and part of that initiative. And just very recently at the G8, we celebrated the announcement of the new Alliance for Food Security, and 3 countries were included in Africa. When I mentioned earlier about the emphasis on partnerships, it's important to note that in shaping these new initiatives, these intensive partnerships with countries, we signed up more than $3 billion worth of commitments on the part of the private sector to invest once development objectives have been achieved. And then the last one is the Global Climate Change Initiative. And again, that is helping African countries deal with water issues and any possible changes in climate. One point I do want to mention, and this came up, I had the privilege of being on Mr. Froman's delegation last week, and we were there for the signing of, if you will, the first partnership on Africa called the Partnership for Growth in Tanzania. And this really will help shape in the future the way that we interact with governments and people, from the top, very top of the government, to people working in ministries, the everyday government official. They talked about the importance of this intensive partnership, not just with AID, but other government agencies, in coming up with a program to help them sharpen their economic development focus and to address the binding constraints. It made a huge believer out of me, and I think others who were on the delegation. Let me just conclude by saying that with the strategic prominence being placed on Africa, we in AID are also making the shifts. Ben mentioned that resources, human as well as program resources, will be shifting to address this, and using our benchmark of 2 years ago, the number of Foreign Service officers, within the next 1.5 to 2 years, we expect to triple the number of officers we have on the continent. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We now wanted to open it up to questions. We're getting a flurry of questions both from Twitter, Facebook, and whitehouse.gov. We've got 2 microphones on either side, and so I'm going to do a combination of questions from online and also from the microphone. I see very few people have questions, though. We really want audience participation. Right? Okay. So I think what we're going to do in the interest of time is I'll take a few questions and then we'll put it to the panel. I'm going to, as I said, intersperse them with questions that we're getting from online participants as well. Be sure when you state your question, make sure that you introduce yourself and with any affiliation that you have as well. And we'll try to, in the interest of time, as I said, keep the questions shorter and so that we can put them to the panel. Let's go ahead and start off over here. We'll do questions from each side, and then I'll do a question from online, and we'll go from there. Yeah, please.
My name is Bernadette Palo, and I'm the president and CEO of the Africa Society. I want to thank all of you for this public engagement strategy and all the information provided by the 100 years of experience of the people sitting here.
It's Joe's experience.
I want my question goes to AGOA specifically. During the AGOA forum, ministers said that AGOA creates goodwill for our country all over the world, all over sub-Saharan Africa specifically. And yet we have a fight waging in the Senate. 2 senators are impeding the passage of the third country fabric provision of AGOA. We've already lost close to 100,000 jobs, and the deadline for passage is September 30th. Adjournment is later this week, and they don't reconvene until September 13th. My question is, can President Obama speak out on this third country fabric provision or call the senators that are impeding its passage? I think it's a very small provision with very large implications. And I would also ask Ambassador Carson if Secretary Clinton can do the same. It's time to pull out all stops on this measure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. How about from this side?
Hi, I'm Nora O'Connell with Save the Children, and I just want to echo my thanks to all of you for being here and for this opportunity for this discussion. It was great to hear a lot about the focus on building local capacity at the country level and at the regional level throughout sub-Saharan Africa. We heard a lot that was very clear about how we're going to build government institutional capacity, but we heard less clarity actually on building civil society institutional capacity beyond just identifying those leaders. And I would say that for the vision that we have around both governance and inclusive growth, strong civil society institutions are essential partners, and we can't strengthen one side without strengthening the other and expect the kind of outcomes that we want, because they're essential for building both the demand but also the accountability on both governance and also on inclusive growth. So my question is, it would be great to actually hear more about the plans to build strong civil society institutions, again, both not only on democracy and governance, but also on inclusive growth to foster accountability, not only of governments, but also the private sector engagement that we've highlighted will be a critical part to this success. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me add to this a couple of questions that we've received from online as well. We received a few related to the third country fabric provision, which is one that we've already posed from whitehouse.gov. Fred Oladane asked the same question, what are we doing to pass AGOA, the third country fabric provision? We've also gotten a couple of questions on the United States approach to the Horn of Africa. Semhar from Twitter asked, where do regional conflict resolution and development approaches fit in the U.S. Horn of Africa strategy? And a related question from Mil Bayin, also from Twitter, what are the U.S. priorities in the Horn of Africa? I think we can start off with these. Flora, if you wouldn't mind speaking first to third country fabric, and then we can go to others who want to jump in on the Horn of Africa, and of course the question about how we build civil society capacity.
So first, I think many of us in the administration recognize how urgent this situation is with regard to extension of the third country fabric provision of AGOA. I've had the privilege of personally visiting a lot of factories throughout sub-Saharan Africa and seeing lots of women in particular, as well as men who are working in those factories. And it is very distressing to many of us that we are facing this situation right now with a hold on movement of this provision. But let me just say that we are actively, we throughout the administration are actively working. We just had a strategy meeting to talk about what we need to do. We know that we've been working with White House Leg Affairs, the USTR's Leg Affairs and White House Leg Affairs have been working together on this to identify ways that we can push on this issue and try to see what can be done to unlock this. So, you know, the answer to everyone that's concerned, we are not sitting on our hands. You know, we are actively pushing and working to see what can be done this week. Because as Bernadette said, people will be going out on leave soon. We also know that phone calls have been made from cabinet officials. I know my boss, Secretary Clinton, has made phone calls. And so again, there is a significant focus on this issue within the administration to make sure that this thing happens soon.
Please. Let me, if I could, just add and underscore one of the points that Flory has said on AGOA. We recognize the importance of AGOA to Africa, to the creation of jobs, to stimulating investment, and for trade. That trade is also important for us. We are working on the issue full-time, and the answer is absolutely right. Secretary Clinton has made the telephone calls to senators, including some of the very key ones who were involved in this legislation. Calls have been made. We continue to focus on it. Let me, if I could, shift quickly to the Horn of Africa, and say that we believe that it is important to stabilize the current situation in Somalia, to help to do as much as we can to create an opportunity for a new government to be formed after August 20th, to be able to empower that new government to deliver services to its people and to provide security. And we believe in the long run that this is important not only for the people of Somalia, who have been without a central government for some 22, 23 years now, but it's also important for the region as well and for the international community. Somalia is not simply an issue related to Somalia's falling apart alone. Somalia, as we've seen it over the last 2 decades, has spawned something in the neighborhood of 1 million refugees, 600,000 of them living in Kenya, 500,000 in Dadaab refugee camp. But it has also created a large number of illegal arms flows across the border and illegal trade. And for the international community, it has created another problem. It has generated piracy, and it has created a safe haven in Somalia for groups who were prepared to work with Al-Qaeda. So it is in our interest to do as much as we possibly can to help to stabilize Somalia. We are the largest single bilateral contributor to the efforts of AMISOM in the region, and AMISOM has done a wonderful job. We are the largest single provider of relief assistance into the Horn of Africa and into Somalia itself, totaling something in the neighborhood of $1.1 billion over the last 18 months. And we continue to work hard to drive the process of a completion of the transitional federal government into a more established government by August 20th, so that the roadmap that the TFG has been given will in fact be fulfilled. It is a clear desire on our part for multiple reasons to help generate greater stability in that part of the world. It's in our interest, it's in the interest of the region, it's in the interest of the Somali people.
Thank you. Earl?
Sure, let me build on Ambassador Carson's comments. First on Lahore, and then I'll address your question on civil society and civil society's role in development. Certainly we're supporting the process in Somalia, but let me talk about the situation in the Horn, which is improving. But I think the drought over the past year was a wake-up call for us. It was a wake-up call on how we do our work. And so if we look at one of the principal objectives of Feed the Future, it is focus on those areas where you're going to get the most productivity. And then what we saw in our humanitarian response programs was that we were going to other areas and addressing the immediate needs. And once the immediate needs were over, then we withdrew. And we found that we kept going back. And so that led to we in AID, the US government, and other development agencies to rethink our assistance in coming up with a resilient strategy. And that's what we're pursuing now, with EGAD in the lead as a coordinating body, and then also a partnership with other development agencies around the world. And again, what it essentially means is that our development resources will be teamed with our humanitarian resources to make sure that there's a consistent effort in promoting development and livelihoods. With regard to civil society, I agree with you, they're absolutely essential. If it didn't come out in my comments, it's only that I wanted to emphasize the fact that in my view, in the past, we didn't work enough with governments. We did a lot outside of government and didn't build capacity within the government. And we did a lot of things through civil society. So this is a way of trying to build the two together. And when we work with government, one of the principles that we try to promote is that they need to engage properly with their own civil society in coming up with their own policies on development.
Great, thank you. Why don't we take another tranche of questions then, starting from this side.
Hi, Sam Worthington from Interaction. Appreciate your policy and the broad frame you've brought into your approach to Africa. First, just a general comment, and this gets to the point about civil society and the enabling environment for civil society, which we've seen decreasing to some extent across the continent. There's explicit language to the enabling environment of the private sector is critical, but perhaps the enabling environment of civil society as a twinning factor in terms of this. And it really leads to my question, which is one about inclusive economic growth. And we have this tension between parts of the continent, whether it's the Sahel, the Horn, or the DRC, which are in essence more in a humanitarian frame, other areas where we're very much looking at this as effective governance, democracy, and the pull of growth by bringing in the private sector. How do we link those two parts? Because we've got the resilience agenda that seems to be some way of linking of it, but is there a way that the four pillars of your policy come together to address this fact that we have, in essence, two different poles of Africa, one that has a potential for growth and one that is pulling potentially in the direction of greater destabilization and a slowing of the potential of the continent?
Great, thank you, Sam. On this side?
Thank you very much. My name is Fabrice Mussoni. I'm a policy analyst at Humanitarian Genocide. And I wanted to ask my question on the third pillar, which is advancing peace and security. As you may know, and I'm addressing this particularly to Ambassador Johnny Carson, as you know, there's renewed violence in Eastern Congo, and most of it has been blamed, at least. The blame has been laid on Rwanda as due to its support of the mutinous rebels. From that context, what is the United States government doing to advance regional security cooperation and as well as security sector reform? As I've noted that a lot of Congolese civil society organizations have attributed the renewed violence to failed security sector reform. And also another question. This is addressed to Mr. Joseph
I think
McMillan.
I'm just going to have to limit it to one, just given how many people are waiting up there. But it's a great question on Eastern Congo. And I know that's on other people's mind as well. Why don't we, in the interest of time, since there are a lot of people who want to ask questions, let's take two more from here, and some of these overlap as well with what we're seeing online.
Hi, my name is Maria Sculter. I am with the Roosevelt Institute. I'm an undergrad at the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York. And my question is for all the panelists, and it's specifically about youth engagement. So there's a lot of mentions about the United States, the White House looking for feedback from African youth and to engage us in the discussion. But particularly, there's a lot of Africans in the diaspora in the United States. I myself, I was resettled as a refugee from Togo 11 years ago, and ever since being here, because all my family is still back in Africa, I have a very passionate interest in what goes on in Africa, but there hasn't been any platform for African youth in the diaspora to engage the White House. And I was wondering, for people like myself, what are ways for us to get involved in the U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa? Because there's a lot of us here, a lot of students who are very interested in this, so thank you.
Great, thank you. And from over here.
Good morning. I am Amira Woods from Liberia, working at the Institute for Policy Studies. Honored to be here, and thank you to Karen Richardson and her team for making this event possible, and to all of you for your comments. I have a quick query and then a more substantive question. The query is sub-Saharan. Many of us are wondering, this great 5-year plan, why is it sub-Saharan only and not looking at the entire continent, with all that's happening in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, affecting so much of what goes on below the Sahel? The question is just why limited to sub-Saharan? But the more substantive question really is around what Ambassador Carson so brilliantly reminded us of, the words, Africa needing strong institutions, not strong men. And I think the concern of many from the advocacy community is that the institution that's focused most heavily on in terms of the U.S. engagement is the military on the Africa side. And I think there is much concern that there is still a privileging of the military relationship, even in this comprehensive 5-year plan. So we applaud the plan, but to a large extent, it still seems as if the tools in the toolkit all being presented, there's still one tool that's being sharpened, and it is the hammer, the military. And I think the concern is that when you have increasing U.S. military support, assistance, financing, and provision of weapons to places like Ethiopia, clearly Rwanda, we applaud the recent position to pull back on military assistance to Rwanda, but Uganda, there are a lot on the list of those who have committed mass atrocities and human rights violations and are still increasingly accessing U.S. support. And so the question is just in terms of this 5-year plan, what's different when it comes to the privileging of the militaries and
Great.
the U.S. engagement there? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A couple questions online that have similar themes that I think can be addressed at the same time. There was another question as well from online about the role of the diaspora, and how does this is from Mohammed Adimo on Twitter. Does the President's policy directive towards sub-Saharan Africa involve diaspora leaders, activists in the process? So it's certainly on the minds of many. We have some questions as well about Eastern DRC from online, including from Carly Oboth on Twitter, asking what the U.S. is doing to strengthen the security sector in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So there's some overlap there. And Dan Solomon from Twitter asked a question which related to the privileging of the military relationship question as well. AFRICOM has expanded joint operations with African militaries. How will the U.S. work to improve civilian-military balance with bilateral partners? So a few different questions for us to chew on. I think everyone's got something to say on this, so there's no particular order. Joe, do you want to jump in on some of the civilian-military issues, and then we can go down the line, and I'm happy to address some of the youth issues too.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I think I would say it's actually, I don't have the data to back this up, so this is kind of impressionistic, but I would say that the idea that AFRICOM has greatly expanded its military operations or its military support on the continent is I think it would be hard to back that up with data. I think what people are saying is the fact that until a few years ago there was no AFRICOM, and so there's sort of a perception that nothing was happening between the United States military and African countries. There was, it was just being conducted by the European Command. The resources being given to Africa have not expanded in any significant terms, and I defer to Johnny on this, on the numbers, but in terms of the sort of what we think of as the tools that we use for security assistance, for the most part, it's remained constant. Now, there are a few areas clearly where the U.S. military involvement and engagement has gone up, and they're largely the places like Somalia that we talked about. We now have the effort to support the countries of Central Africa in dealing with the LRA threat that I think has been well publicized. But beyond that, the AFRICOM engagement and presence on the continent, I think I would say is surprisingly limited. We have about 2,500 people at Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. Most of what they spend their time doing is actually in support of counterterrorism efforts outside of Africa. Certainly, probably the majority of those people. To some degree, they're supporting the efforts in Somalia, and in large measure, they're in support of development activities in cooperation with other agencies of the U.S. government, by which I mean AID and the State Department. The counter-LRA presence is 100 people, and then the other major thing, if you go to the AFRICOM website and see what they advertise as their big activity, it's something called the Africa Partnership Station. That's a small number of ships that go and visit Africa once a year to work on maritime security, fisheries protection, search and rescue, and those sorts of things. So I think it's an exaggeration to say that there's been a huge growth of military involvement in Africa. And Ambassador Carson is in a better position than I am to give.
Joe, let me underscore exactly what you've said. I think that it would be a gross mistake to say that we are privileging our military relationship with Africa above and beyond the very, very many good things that we have done in the past and continue to do in the future. We provide across Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, somewhere in the neighborhood of about $9 billion worth of development assistance in one form or another, through USAID, through MCC, through OPIC, through Export-Import Bank, and through the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. Many of those things are not seen. But the reality is, over the last 3.5 years of this administration, the things that we have in fact privileged are quite important. We have seen a very robust MCC program. The Millennium Challenge program continues to do good work in Tanzania, in Ghana, in Benin, in Cape Verde, and a number of other countries. It's not as glamorous, it doesn't come in a uniform, but it is in fact building infrastructure, roads, and developing agriculture. Equally, I think some of our colleagues have talked about what we're doing with Feed the Future and the new Agricultural Alliance. For the very first time in probably 4 decades, there is a renewed emphasis by this White House, by this administration, on creating a green agricultural revolution in Africa that will end household starvation, village food shortages, and help to grow and make agriculture, as it is in this country, in many parts of the world, a viable part of the economy. Equally, we have child survival programs, our global health initiatives are all quite significant programs. And as Earl has just said, in the next 18 months to 2 years, we will see a tripling of the number of USAID employees working on the continent. I think that you should not, in fact, be simply guided by the 1 or 2 headlines that you see out there, but in fact by the larger measure of the broad level of U.S. commitment across the board. It's easier to identify a soldier with a weapon, but it's more difficult to see the person who is in a civilian garb doing things to strengthen democracy, to promote development, and to help civil society groups. So take it into context. We're no bigger than we were a few years ago. Our main emphasis is on the democracy and development agendas that are in Africa. We do need always to have our broader security concerns taken into account, but it is our democracy and development and trade agenda which are in fact leading our way across the continent.
Great. Earl, did you want to? We've got the other questions to address.
Sure, I'll address those, and absolutely we're in agreement with what Ambassador Carson mentioned. We also do not agree with the assertion that our engagement is too heavily focused on the security side. But Sam, let me go back to your question because it's a vexing question, and that is, how do we work in very difficult environments? I have experience in Kosovo, in Iraq, also Afghanistan, and if there is one central conclusion that came out of working in all three environments is you can't do development without security. And so this is especially vexing for us in Eastern Congo, where we have very, very limited access, where the NGOs have very, very limited access. I think where we're trying to pull it all together, to answer your question, how do we bring all four together, is in South Sudan. And recognizing that that it's going to be a long-term effort. We're continuing to promote access while at the same time working on really serious development issues. And then let me just mention, just talk briefly about diaspora. I know Grant will talk about the youth component. I've worked on diaspora initiatives before, some of them very good, others not really well thought out on our part. We in AID over the last couple of years for Africa have had diaspora initiatives. One is for investment. There's a new grand challenge that's out for diaspora in Africa. We've also had specific programs designed for Liberia and South Sudan on how we can bring back the well-educated labor force that left to help get them involved in the development aspects. So it's something that we're mindful of. It can't be just U.S.-led. We think that it's better if it's an international-led effort in trying to bring the diaspora back to African countries for development purposes.
Do you want to say another word on Eastern Congo generally?
Yeah, let me, absolutely. Let me say that we are seized today with the high level of tension that exists in and around Goma, and particularly in the North Kivus. We have been actively encouraging both sides in that conflict to diffuse the tensions. We believe that it is critically important that both the leaders of the DRC and Rwanda come together, meet on a regular and routine basis, and find a way to ensure that neither country is doing anything to undermine the stability or the security of the other. Both countries have responsibilities. The responsibility in the DRC is to do everything that it can to bring armed groups under control, including elements of the FDLR, the ex-FAR Interahamwe, who may still exist in the Kivus and Ituri, as well as other armed groups. But it's also equally important that the Rwandan government not, in fact, support elements of the M23, Bosco Ntaganda, who is a ICC indictee as well. Both need to work together to diffuse the tensions there. But in addition to that, the DRC faces many, many enormous challenges, and we are trying to work with the government to improve its human rights performance, its protection of civilians, to manage its resources better, to reform its security services, and to provide better services to the people of the Eastern Congo. So we are engaged across a broad front with all of the regional players, and I can tell you that it is one of our highest priorities at this point.
Great, thank you very much. I think Earl also well fielded the diaspora question. I would just add that it's an important component of each pillar of the strategy. The Doing Business in Africa campaign wants to also better link with diaspora here in the United States. Our Young African Leaders Initiative also wants to better connect, including with universities and college campuses, but diaspora here to be a part of that. So there will be more from us on that going forward. I've got to apologize in advance to people who've been standing. I know that we're getting short on time. We're not going to get through everybody's question because the lines just won't permit it. We can figure out a way to follow up though and make sure, because we do appreciate people coming out. Let's try to take a few more questions. Please keep them short and a single question so that we can then combine that with just the closing thoughts from the panel. Please.
Hi, my name is Ian Schwab with American Jewish World Service. Good afternoon and thanks for having this. My question deals with food security. We've talked a lot about the Feed the Future initiative, which is obviously not just Africa specific. And I was curious also about another program, which is international food aid in the upcoming Farm Bill negotiations. And if the US government sees as part of its strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa the reform of international food aid, particularly as it relates to the sustainability of local markets during humanitarian crises and their role in promoting sustainable agriculture. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And on this side?
Paul Miller, Catholic Relief Services. Again, thanks to the panel and to the organizers. My question is about, Ambassador Carson called them backsliders, but I'm thinking about those countries that are still governed by dictatorships or where democracy is lacking yet also receive significant aid, as well as aid orphans, those countries that don't have good governments and the U.S. is not investing as much. Chad, in the fiscal year 13 presidential request, received 0 in development assistance, if I'm not mistaken. And yet it was the scene of one of the largest private sector investments by ExxonMobil for the pipeline. So my question, and I think Assistant Administrator Gass, you mentioned the case of Ethiopia in some testimony saying it wasn't the time to invest in democracy and governance there until there was more political space. So that's a question of maybe falling between the pillars. An ally, a strategic ally, yet one where democracy is threatened, even as some development gains have gone on. At the same time, what about aid orphans, those countries which are not well governed and so the governments can't responsibly use U.S. foreign assistance, yet a place like Chad might be very important to invest in to avoid future problems.
Okay, on this side?
Great, thank you. Eric LeCompte, Jubilee USA Network. I really appreciate how you've laid out a lot of the thinking in the report, especially under the 4th pillar. Under the first point there, which is addressing constraints to economic growth and promoting poverty reduction. It seems that there's a lot of really important opportunities there that don't cost a lot, but actually have really big impacts. And I guess what's, I think, really important about that point is that rightly you connect debt with revenues. And I think if we're really looking at the economic question, we need to address both of those. So I guess first, the first side of that, on the debt side, from the public sector side, looking at the ability that the administration wants to leverage the international financial institutions around more lending. I think even more importantly is around responsible lending and borrowing. That has been endorsed by the U.S. administration as voluntary principles, the UN Committee on Trade and Development, that actually moving this forward not only starts to look at reducing debts, but also, just as importantly, promotes accountability, transparency, anti-corruption. And the other side of that, which is the revenue side, which also I think is rightly connected, that there's a huge reality that aid can be minimized, lending can be minimized, if the African people are actually able to legitimately access the wealth that's being generated there. And again, looking at the energy sector in terms of...
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you please tell us the question?
Sure. In terms of illicit financial flows, although the administration is very clearly supportive of trying to curb this so that African people can have their own money to invest in healthcare, to invest in their own economies, to reduce the need for debt and lending, I guess where's the discussion right now about how we're actually to get this done and stop these illicit financial flows so that people could have access to real revenues in their countries?
Okay, thank you, sir. On this side?
Hi, my name is Gloria. I'm with Washington Center and the National Committee to Preserve Social Security. Thank you once again for holding this panel. My question is, it's been mentioned that the U.S. is the largest bilateral donor to Africa. So, but we have other donors. For example, you have OECD and the European Union. So my question is, are you combining with other donors in order to achieve a maximum impact, or in order to try to eliminate duplication? And also my other question is,
I'm going to just leave it there. I'm sorry. Just in the interest of the people standing behind you, I want to try to get to as many people as we can. Yeah, thank you though very much. I think we could probably squeeze in just a couple more if they're short questions, and then we'll put it to the panelists to just give a quick summation, since we really are out of time. But we very much appreciate the questions, and so we want to get as many as we can.
My name is Jacques Bahati. I'm with the Africa Faith and Justice Network. Doing business in Africa when you have no partners, how that is possible? We see land grabbing already. American businesses involved in land grabbing from the African people. Also, toxic dumping on the African continent and usage of those toxin products. Who will defend the African people against the industries from developed countries?
Okay, great, thank you. On this side?
I'm Andrea Koppel with the international NGO Mercy Corps, and I understand Assistant Secretary Carson was just in Bamako. My question has to do with Mali. As you well know, the situation is looking as if it's going to be more of a protracted crisis. So we want to know whether there is a whole of government approach that the U.S. Has in mind, as well as you know that one of the silent players in this crisis is Algeria. If you look beyond the role that Algeria can play in trying to keep Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb out of Algiers, what else do you have in mind to engage Algeria to be a constructive player? And looking that the situation right now is going to spread beyond Mali into Niger and Burkina Faso, we also believe that it could spread north into the Maghreb. So what does the U.S. have in mind for a regional approach to trying to resolve this situation? We would strongly recommend having programs that address and engage the youth, employment opportunities, and things of that nature. So especially in the Maghreb. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got quite a collection. There's I think I'm going to have to take it there. We had a couple more from online as well, but one in particular matches up with the theme of sustainable and supportive of local development. There was a question posed on Facebook by the One Campaign asking, what action is the government going to take to ensure that aid and development work coming from the U.S. is sustainable and supportive of local development? It dovetails really with one of the questions that was asked before. So we've got a mix. I realize that we haven't gotten to everyone, but as we've tried to emphasize throughout, this isn't the only event where we'll be having this type of dialogue. We've got an email address for questions, but we'll also be having future events where we want to make sure that we get to your questions, any ones that weren't answered today. Let me give the email address so that everyone has it. But it's international@who.eop.gov. international@who.eop.gov. That's another venue with our Office of Public Engagement to keep the conversation going. We've got questions on food security, on investing in political space, including with respect to how that relates to aid orphans, on stopping illicit financial flows, combining our work with other donors to maximize impact, defending industries and Africans in the economic sphere, and on Mali with a whole of government and a regional approach. It's got a little of something for all of our panelists. And I want to thank all the panelists as well for taking the time to do this. And I do want everyone to clap at the end, absolutely. And I appreciate the enthusiasm. It just goes to show that we do appreciate it. But starting with you, Johnny, if we could just take those questions and make any final thoughts that you wanted to give, and then we'll wrap up. And we had just one more speaker from the Office of Public Engagement. John Carson, the director of that office, was going to just give a couple of closing remarks.
Let me, there were a lot of great questions, and I'm not going to do justice to the responses here. But let me just say, on countries that are not that are backsliding, they don't fall through the cracks. I think under the number 4th sort of subset under strengthening democratic institutions, I said that we're trying to ensure a sustained focus on the credibility of the democratic process. We're engaging with countries that are in fact not moving in the right direction, and we're speaking out against those government leaders who do not make substantial progress. This doesn't mean that we cut off our humanitarian support or our emergency food aid to some countries and some leaders and governments. We can have multiple dialogues going on at the same time. And in many of the countries where we do see backsliding, we do have a democratic agenda. We are talking with those government leaders. We are pressing our points on human rights, opening up government space, not falling back on term limitations and doing things like that. So that those discussions are there. Let me also say that transparency in government institutions is absolutely critical, and to those who are pushing to ensure that revenues and money earned in the country are not illegally taken out or not exported illegally. Again, that's a part of the strengthening of democratic institutions there. Building in greater transparency and accountability on the part of legislatures to have and hold committee hearings, creating organizations like our own General Accounting Office, creating organizations like our own budget office, so that there is transparency in the way that governments have to handle their resources, and there's public accountability. We also argue that it's important that governments join things like EITI, that they have laws on the books that ensure that royalties and revenues that come in from oil or mineral contracts are thoroughly accounted for, are seen transparently in a process in which the government's royalties or their share of the royalties are presented as an open item in the budget. So this is a part of the strengthening of democratic institutions that is absolutely important. Legislatures have a responsibility of oversight. We're out there working to create committee systems, helping to create committees that are auditing government revenues, and helping to create general accounting offices and auditing offices that will be able to do these sorts of things. It's absolutely critical. Let me just a quick question on Mali. I will not do it justice. We see Mali as an extraordinarily complex problem. It is a problem of restoration of democratic governance in Bamako. We see it as a problem of trying to deal with the political, and I stress the political issues of the Tuareg, secondly, and those have to be negotiated out. Thirdly, we see a real terrorism problem with AQIM, with Mujoa, and with Ansar el-Din. That is different from dealing with the political issues of the Tuareg. The Tuareg have had political issues that go back decades and decades and decades. They need to be resolved politically. Dealing with AQIM will require a security and military response, but many of those people are non-Malians. They have come across the border from Algeria as a part of the remnants of the GSPCU. They are part of the groups that have come out of Libya and North Africa in general. And then fourthly, there is a humanitarian assistance problem there that has to be dealt with. It is a food insecure and now a food shortage region of the world. All of those issues must be dealt with, and they must be dealt with in a thoughtful and in a comprehensive fashion. We are pushing as hard as we can to ensure that the government there live up to the agreements that they made in Ouagadougou on July 7th, where they said that they would have an inclusive government by July 31, and that they would have a roadmap and a timetable for elections and a return to democracy. This is a first step. And on the CT side of it, we have had a long time a program called the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Program that has been in the region for a long time. It supports the states in the region to build up their border security, their militaries to deal with terrorist threats, and their inter-regional cooperation. This is absolutely important for us to continue to work with those states as long as the insecurity remains. And on Algeria, we do engage the Algerians. We see them as an essential part of the solution. We hope that they will work effectively with ECOWAS and the states in the region. They all have a vested interest in making sure that Mali is, in fact, a stable country which is not divided.
Thank you.
I just want to speak quickly. A couple of the questions touched on this. The role of private sector and private enterprise. You know, obviously, there have been a lot of U.S. companies that have been on the continent investing in key sectors. Many of them have been in the past extractive. But actually what we're seeing today is a range of investment across a number of sectors, including agribusiness, manufacturing, and so we have to look at the fact that Africa is asking for investment. There isn't any country that we visit that doesn't say we want more U.S. investment. We want more of the world's foreign direct investment, FDI, coming into Africa. It currently has less than 2%. Inward investment is what has grown this country and every other country around the world in regions where they are now on the path of sustainable development of their economies, producing jobs, training people, giving them the skills. So there is a role that private sector can play that's a very positive one. And we believe that many U.S. companies are in fact playing that role. But I would end by saying that there is so much more room for investment into Africa, for joint ventures between U.S. companies and African businesses. And we are actively looking at that, and a number of U.S. government agencies are supporting that. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the Export-Import Bank. So again, this is an area where perhaps we have to think about it as something that is evolving from what people used to think about it in the past to what it actually currently is today.
Thank you.
You asked the question about the 8 orphans, and I have to say it is a troubling question and something that we struggle with. And one of the principles that came out of the President's policy on development a couple of years ago was that it was the recognition that we wouldn't be able to do it all. But we can use our resources to help leverage other resources, and we can have more and stronger engagement with other development partners, to include the multilaterals. So there is a renewed effort in engaging the multilaterals, especially the African Development Bank, more resources coming in to include the World Bank, as well as bilateral donors. So you specifically mentioned Chad, and that is an area of concern, as well as other countries in the Sahel, to include Niger. With regard to food security, the U.S. government has always been the largest contributor to humanitarian assistance needs around the world. I don't suspect that that will go away. What we want to do is to make sure that we have better integration between our development programs and our humanitarian food aid assistance programs. And so we're seeing that play out now in the Horn of Africa. And in fact, there is a team that's out in the Sahel, led by our Assistant Administrator for Humanitarian Operations, Nancy Limborg, to try and recreate that with Europeans and with the countries of the Sahel. And then with regard to the last question on how are we ensuring local sustainable development, I can tell you that it is a principle of not only this PPD in Africa, but it is also a principle in the President's policy on development. What we are doing to ensure that that is indeed a part of our portfolios and our programs, we're doing country strategies in all of our countries. And so we'll have 17 country strategies by the end of this year. Again, really focusing on local development, making sure that that our programs are accountable to both civil society and governments, that the priorities in our development programs reflect their priorities. We're also trying to ensure that by having portfolio reviews of our programs, including the ambassadors that post with host countries. Let me just say that I know that this is sustainable local development is a priority of our administrator. I've been in a number of meetings with him, with government officials, where at the first hint that we're not being responsible in our development programs, there have been major commitments to retool our efforts. And so we're working throughout the continent in retooling our efforts to be accountable to the government and people. Thanks.
Thank you. Joe?
It's sort of bad timing that the last thing you hear as you walk out the room will be the military security pillar. Hopefully somebody's going to talk after me. Don't worry. So that it won't be. I guess sort of one specific point and then a broader one to kind of recapture what I started off with. One on Algeria. We in the Defense Department, actually we do the question about sub-Sahara. We actually do manage all of Africa as one entity, with the exception of Egypt, which tends to look more to the east than it does to the west and south, at least for our interest. But we do have a regular bilateral military discussion with the Algerians, in which the AQIM problem is predictably the central point of discussion. In a way, the complexities of those discussions reflect the value of having standing relationships that endure over a period of years, because it's a very difficult conversation with the Algerians, especially when you compare it to interacting with Moroccans, Tunisians, with whom we have longer standing relations. There's a history of suspicion on both sides that still hasn't been overcome. And so it complicates the task of cooperation on the AQIM problem, even though both of us can sit in the meetings and agree wholeheartedly that it's the central challenge that we both face. But we're working to overcome that in concert with our State Department colleagues who address other aspects, related aspects of the issue. On the broader issue, I mentioned the strategic defense guidance that came out in January. This is, for those who deal with most of the world other than Africa, this is the Rebalance to Asia document that everyone will have heard of. I know for those who deal with Africa in the Defense Department, it was a rather disappointing mention of Africa. It was confined to one line in the entire document, and the one line basically said that because most of our military attention has to be on other parts of the world, we will deal with African security problems of concern to us by cooperating with African countries. This is really a recasting of the same thing that we've been saying for years, that on the security front, what we look for is African solutions to African problems. And what we in the Defense Department, what the Africa Command is about, is trying to equip our African partners to deal with African problems and to do it effectively. Ultimately, the security challenge comes down to human security in one form or another. We're very clear with the African militaries that we deal with that it's very rare that military action by itself solves the kinds of challenges that these countries face. That the solutions lie in political development and economic areas, the other three pillars that we've talked about. But it's equally the reality that there are, to put it sort of in colloquial terms, there are bad people with guns roaming around that governments need to be able to deal with. And I would finally add, one of the challenges that we see is that, and I'm sure many of you know this, a lot of African militaries had their origins in essentially colonial constabulary forces. The cultural ethic of these institutions is often not what we would expect in a democratic society, that militaries exist to protect their people. And so a big part, a constant message in our interaction through AFRICOM and in my office's interaction with our colleagues is that is indeed what militaries are supposed to exist for, is to protect the people of their countries and to provide the security people need to get on with the other and arguably more important aspects of life. So I just wanted to reassure you that it's that mentality that is shaping our interaction with Africa. And if you were to visit people at AFRICOM, if you visit any of the small number of American military people who are on the continent at any one time, I think you'd hear that message pretty faithfully repeated all the way down the line.
Thank you. One final note from Johnny Carson before we introduce our last speaker.
Yeah. Let me just, if I could, just note for everyone present that tomorrow the Secretary of State Clinton will depart on a multi-stop visit across Africa that will take her to West, Central, East, and Southern Africa. The focal point of this will be in South Africa, where she will participate in the next round of the U.S. South African strategic dialogues as a guest of her counterpart, Foreign Minister Mashabane. But we expect this trip to be a long one, multiple stops, as I say, in East, Central, West, and Southern Africa.
Thank you very much. I think you've heard from the panel and from the give and take with the questions that the U.S. strategy lays forth very comprehensive the vision. I think the note that the President put on top of it gives a very clear statement of how we see Africa. And he said that America believes in Africa as a region of growing opportunity and promise for Africa, for America, and for our people and our economies. I know it's come through in each of the pillars. I think the participation on the panel, we have some concluding remarks from John Carson, who's the Director of the Office of Public Engagement here at the White House. Many thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, Grant, and thanks so much, everyone who's been following us along online, everyone here in the audience, and a big thank you to our presenters and our panel. This has been a great session. I've been following this is some pretty robust conversation on Twitter, probably some of you here in the audience and at home as well participating in that. So I'm actually here to end the day with an ask of all of you, of our audience, those online, those here, and of our presenters, which is to keep this conversation going. Every one of you are here for a reason. You're connected to Africa. You're connected to these issues. You're connected to what we can do together to make a difference. And while we've had a great group here today and very big group following online, we need your help in connecting more people to this. Help us tell the story of what you learned today. I ask you to do that, I think, for two different reasons. First of all, I'm sure even our panelists today, from the questions, the two-way conversation, everyone is leaving this room or leaving this conversation knowing something you didn't know this morning. One more unique approach, a best practice, something one of these agencies is doing that can help make a bigger difference. But I think more importantly than that, I think what you take from the Obama administration's focus on the 4 pillars, what you take, I think, from our approach to development and international issues in general, is that we need more people being part of the solutions. The way we have opened up and connected to nonprofit organizations,
businesses, to make them all a part of this effort. We need your help in encouraging others to be a part of the solution as well. So thank you again to our panelists. Thanks to everyone who's here. We'll keep using these hashtags. Karen and I will keep an eye on the conversation. Help us get more people involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much.